The Young Lords, later Young Lords Organization, and in New York, Young Lords Party, was a Puerto Rican nationalist group in several United States cities, notably New York City and Chicago. Founding, the Young Lords began as a Puerto Rican turf gang in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago in the fall of 1960 and is a civil and human rights movement on Grito de Lares, September 23, 1868. During Mayor Daley's tenure, Puerto Ricans in Lincoln Park and several Mexican communities were completely evicted from areas near the Loop, Lakefront, Old Town, Lakeview and Lincoln Park in order to increase property tax revenues. When they realized that urban renewal was evicting the families from the barrios and witnessed police abuses, some Puerto Ricans became involved in the June 1966 Division Street riots in Wicker Park and Humboldt Park. They were officially reorganized from the gang into a civil and human rights movement by José Cha-Cha Jiménez, who was the last president of the former gang and became the founder of the new Young Lords movement. Puerto Rican self-determination and the displacement of Puerto Ricans and poor residents from prime real estate areas for profit became the primary focus of the original movement. Since there were few Latino students and no outspoken leadership at the time, the former street gang transformed themselves, training leadership and organizing the broad community. Multiple chapters began forming nationwide, with several in NYC. On July 26, 1969, the national headquarters in Chicago asked a loose coalition of chapters to form the New York branch. Later, they were sanctioned as the regional chapter, accepting neighborhood empowerment and Puerto Rican self-determination as the unifying mission. The national office in Chicago, where the movement originated, gave approval primarily because New York then was where nearly 80% of the Puerto Ricans on the mainland lived and therefore was then the center of the Puerto Rican diaspora. Nevertheless, the Young Lords originated from the transformed lumpen proletariat of Chicago, which mobilized various social classes and various ethnic peoples in the community. The office in Chicago was attempting to build a nationwide grassroots movement within the barrios to unite Puerto Ricans and other Latinos to carry out its mission to free Puerto Rico. The New York chapter formed just 10 months after the Young Lords movement began in Lincoln Park, Chicago, and after the Young Lords had already gained national prominence by leading protests against conditions faced by Puerto Ricans on the mainland. Media savvy and adjacent to the New York media centers, the New York chapter, located in a heavily Puerto Rican district, provided the then needed support for the national headquarters, which was then being suppressed by Chicago's city government. They also helped to catapult the movement to more prominence. National headquarters' first action was ransacking and the closure of the Department of Urban Renewal office in Chicago. Later, in New York, it was their garbage offensive which sparked the chapter. Both offensives targeted local city governments, calling for community control and neighborhood empowerment while linking it to international movements and the primary mission to free Puerto Rico. They mounted occupations of institutions in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood to pressure them to support affordable housing for working families, and these actions spread the group across the country. The New York members first read about Chicago's Young Lords in an issue of the Black Panther newspaper, which spoke also about actions for Puerto Rican and Latino self-determination, and increasing repression of the group. The East Coast then followed the pattern set by Chicago and conducted a takeover of the First Spanish United Methodist Church in East Harlem on December 28, 1969. This took place after the sit-in at Chicago's Grant Hospital, the takeover of People's Park, the occupation of McCormick Seminary, and the June occupation of Chicago's People's Church, where the Young Lords set up free community programs. United Methodist pastor Rev. Bruce Johnson, who retained his church, was part of the Northside Cooperative Ministry that worked on social justice concerns. They were able to direct funds to support the Young Lords programs. The assistant pastor of the Young Lords People's Church in Chicago, Rev. Sergio Herrera, was of Cuban ancestry and initially did not agree with the Young Lords Church occupation or the murals of Che Guevara and Don Pedro Albizu Campos. He did later participate in all the neighborhood events. Immediately the day after the May 1969 Armitage Avenue United Methodist Church occupation, the Young Lords set up programs inside People's Church, and it remained the Young Lords' national headquarters for nearly 2 years. On September 29, 1969, the church's pastor and his wife, Reverend Bruce Johnson and Eugenia Johnson, were both found murdered in the parsonage home. They were both stabbed multiple times in a cold case that has not been solved. The assistant pastor, U.M.C. Rev. Sergio Herrera, was soon transferred to Los Angeles and not long after was also discovered murdered. The timing of the murders of U.M.C. pastor Rev. Bruce Johnson and his wife, and the assistant pastor, Rev. Sergio Herrera, were connected to the work with the Young Lords. Threats and letters to Bishop Pryor to oust the two ministers and the Young Lords were being made, and the court fined People's Church $200 a day. For every day the free daycare center remained open. The Young Lords have held several events together with the United Methodist Church calling for a full investigation, to no avail. Expansion. New York City, where 1/4 of Puerto Ricans then lived, and Chicago were the two largest Puerto Rican hubs. Puerto Rican mainland communities also developed elsewhere during the Great Puerto Rican Migration of the 1950s, so in 1969. Subsequent branches organized themselves in Philadelphia, Connecticut, New Jersey, Boston, Milwaukee, Hayward, San Diego, Los Angeles, and Puerto Rico. The newspapers, The Young Lord, Peter and Parlanti, reported on their increasingly militant activities. Today, back issues of some of them are housed at DePaul University's Richardson Library Special Collection. Over 120 oral histories entitled Young Lords in Lincoln Park are housed at Grand Valley State University in Michigan and accessible via the web. Besides the National Black Panther Party office of Oakland, California, and the Illinois chapter of the Panthers in Chicago, which was where they integrated into the Rainbow Coalition by Fred Hampton. The Young Lords were also in local coalitions with the Northside Cooperative Ministry and the Lincoln Park Poor People's Coalition. The Young Lords organized conferences and marches calling for Puerto Rican independence. The Young Lords grew into a national movement through the leadership of activists like Angela Linda Dorneur, who met with Vietnamese women, Omar Lopez, David Rivera, Field Marshal Drive, Tony Baez, a leader in bilingual, bicultural education, and Richie Perez, who established the Puerto Rican Student Union in a number of college campuses and high schools. By May 1970, the New York section followed its then Central Committee with Felipe Luciano, chairman, David Perez, Minister of Defense, Juan Gonzalez, Minister of Education, Pablo Guzman, Minister of Information, Joan Fay Ortiz, Minister of Finance, and Denise Oliver, Officer of the Day and later Minister of Economic Development, and decided to break away from the National Young Lords office in Chicago and renamed the new group the Young Lords Party. The separation was never a hostile one and had more to do with the rapid development of the group or growing pains, a natural friendly competition between cities, and primarily by infiltration and repression by government groups that were trying to divide and destroy the newly formed movement. Branches in New Jersey, Boston, Philadelphia and Bridgeport, Connecticut remained affiliated with New York as they were the regional chapter. All the other chapters remained with national headquarters in Chicago. It was a major blow for the Puerto Rican liberation movement and a major separation of the organization. It was the same situation that was then occurring within other movements such as the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, the Young Patriots and the American Indian Movement, as revealed in COINTELPRO documents. All the other Young Lords chapters across the United States remained tied to national headquarters in Chicago. The Young Lords in New York and Chicago continued to grow in numbers and influence from 1968 to 1983, where Jose Chacha Jimenez introduced the newly elected African-American mayor to Chicago, Harold Washington. Before her June crowd the Young Lords helped organize in Humboldt Park, Chicago, of 100,000 Puerto Ricans. Social action. The Young Lords supported independence for Puerto Rico, all Latino nations and oppressed nations of the world, and also neighborhood empowerment. This is clear by the original symbol with a map of Puerto Rico and a brown fist holding up a rifle and the purple lettering reading, Tango Puerto Rico en mi corazón. They saw themselves as a people's struggle, a vanguard connected with the masses, and it is why they began in Chicago fighting against the displacement of Puerto Ricans from Lincoln Park. While the national symbol and YLO appeared on buttons, the New York chapter began the local garbage offensive, which was an effort to clean up the streets. Organizers had spent weeks cleaning up garbage that the city was not picking up and needed addition brooms, shovels, trash bags, and other clean-up supplies, so they asked the New York Department of Garbage for assistance and were refused. To respond and show the disgruntlement with the city's failure to provide basic services, they blocked 3rd Avenue traffic at 110th, 111th, and 112th Street. The Young Lords also addressed the local issues of police injustice, health care, tenants' rights, free breakfast for children, free day care, and more accurate Latino education. The Urban Renewal Campaign was framed by the Chicago office as the modern-day land question, since Emiliano Zapata, who said, "All revolutions are based on land," was then being studied. In March 1970, the Young Lords opened a South Bronx information center that established Parlante, a newspaper which was later printed and distributed in New York by Young Lords. It was similar to earlier Young Lords newspapers El Pitar and El Young Lord. The latter was printed while the entire National Central Committee in Chicago was underground due to constant police harassment. The Young Lords created community projects similar to those of the Black Panthers but with a Latino flavor, such as the Free Breakfast Program for Children, Emeterio Beatance's Free Health Clinic, community testing for tuberculosis, lead poisoning testing, free clothing drives, cultural events and Puerto Rican history classes. In Chicago, they also set up a free dental clinic and a free community daycare center. There was also work on prison solidarity for incarcerated Puerto Ricans and for the rights of Vietnam War veterans. The female leadership in New York pushed the Young Lords to fight for women's rights. In Chicago, it was a subgroup within the Young Lords Lords led by Hilda Ignaton, Judy Cordero and Angela Adorno, called Mothers and Others, that organized around women's rights and helped to educate the male members and the community at large. The Young Lords carried out many direct action occupations of vacant land, hospitals, churches and other institutions to demand that they operate programs for the poor. This included a campaign to force the city of New York to increase garbage pickup in Spanish Harlem. In Chicago, the 7-day McCormick Theological Seminary takeover won Lincoln Park residents $650,000 to be used for low-income housing. The 4-month People's Park campout takeover at Halsted and Armitage Avenue by 350 community residents prevented the construction of a for-profit tennis court where low-income persons once lived in affordable housing. In New York, much of the local health care activism was carried out by a mass organization they formed with the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement. In Chicago, the Young Lords Health Program was coordinated by Dr. Jack Johns, Quentin Young, Anna Lucas, and Alberto and Marta Chavarria, who also worked with a Black Panther-led coalition under Doc Satchel to recruit medical student organizations, like the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which advocated for health care for the poor. Cultural influence. The Young Lords inspired young political and community leaders, professionals and artists, forming part of a Puerto Rican cultural renaissance in the 1970s within the continental United States. In New York City, it was locally known as the New Yorican movement, although it was part of a nationwide development within the Puerto Rican diaspora. It included poetry and music. In New York, Felipe Luciano, already a well-known poet within black nationalist circles in Harlem, became the deputy chairman of the New York regional chapter. He was himself expelled by the later Young Lords Party, though Chicago never recognized the expulsion. He recited many poems that he wrote while a member of the Last Poets, including Jibaro, Unrifle Oration and Hey Now. The poet Pedro Pietri wrote and publicly recited his poems, Puerto Rican Obituary, and Suicide Note of a Cockroach in a Low-Income Project, at New York Young Lord events. Alfredo Mechas wrote poems about Afro-Boricua pride, and David Hernandez, also of Chicago, recited La Armitage about the Chicago street that became the downtown for Puerto Ricans and the Young Lords. This street extended from Lincoln Park to Humboldt Park and beyond. The song "Que Acute Bonita Bandera" was written by Pepe y Flora in Puerto Rico and was adopted by the Young Lords as their anthem. It was sung live many times during the takeover of McCormick Theological Seminary and the People's Church in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, along with the later occupation of the New York People's Church in Spanish Harlem. Repression. The Young Lords were a target of the FBI's COINTELPRO, which had long harassed Puerto Rican independence groups. The New York-Chicago schism mirrored the divide and conquer divisions within other New Left groups like the Black Panther Party, Students for a Democratic Society, Brown Berets, and many other New Left movements. All of these organizations were repressed. At first the splits were believed to be the result of growing pains, as this movement was very young and spread quickly, but it is now documented that it was primarily due to police infiltration by informants and provocateurs, and planned and shaped by the ongoing undercover work of the FBI's COINTELPRO. The leaders were framed, beaten, given high bonds, imprisoned, harassed, and discredited. The entire Chicago leadership was forced underground in order to reorganize itself. Tactics against the movements included negative rumor campaigns, pitting groups against each other, and the creation of factionalism, distrust and personality conflicts. In Chicago, COINTELPRO created an official anti-rainbow coalition component. Members were interviewed in public view in front of the church. The Red Squad was also parked 24 hours a day in front of the national headquarters. Other harassment included inciting quarrels between spouses and between members and allies. The founder and chairman, José Chacha Jiménez, became the main target and not only was indicted 18 times in a 6-week period for felony charges such as assault and battery on police-to-mob action, he was kept in the county jail, or in courtrooms fighting the charges, and received constant death threats. The intent was to cripple the organization, while the Young Lords advocated armed strategies similar to those advocated by the Black Panthers. It was as a right of self-defense, and rarely arose. It did after the shooting of Manuel Ramos and the implications of police foul play in the circumstances surrounding the beating death of José Lind. The supposed suicide of Julio Roldan in the custody of the NYPD and the fatal stabbings in Chicago of the United Methodist Church Rev. Bruce Johnson and his wife Eugenia. The Johnsons continued to pastor in Sunday services in Lincoln Park at the Young Lords First People's Church in Chicago. The Young Lords also accused the FBI COINTELPRO of killing Young Lord members. Like other radical organizations supporting oppressed groups, the Young Lords were working within their communities to provide resources that were withheld from them. Similar to the Brown Berets and the Black Panther Party, their overall goals were to demonstrate efforts that would help others become aware of the oppression they were facing, as well as helping others understand the struggle of many Puerto Rican men and women, while teaching the history behind the movement. The book, The Young Lords, a reader explains the purpose, goals, and tactics of the Young Lords. Puerto Ricans have suffered as a group racially and culturally, not as individuals. Therefore the fight against Americanism must be a group struggle. Through this passage, the author is trying to convey the deeper message that Puerto Ricans have been oppressed overall as a group, and that each person that identifies as Puerto Ricans has suffered, while feeling the pain for the fellow Puerto Rican brothers, sisters, friends, and close relatives. The author is also arguing that Puerto Ricans must fight against America and its people as a nation, not individually. In the text, the author also validates the primary strategy of this group, this goal being to educate those in the community that weren't aware of the repression taking place, then choosing to escalate and become armed. Decline and aftermath. By 1973, the Young Lords had been crippled. José Chacha Jiménez was on the run, underground along with most of the national leadership. It was later learned that Jiménez had set up an underground training school at a farm near Tomah, Wisconsin. Many members independently continued to pursue self-determination for Puerto Rico and other nations, as well as neighborhood empowerment. In Chicago, the Young Lords resurfaced after 2.5 years in the underground training camp. Meanwhile, the New York Young Lords and other chapters had helped to fill the void of a national headquarters crippled under direct attack and force. Underground. Soon afterwards, the Young Lords ran the Jiménez 1975 aldermanic campaign. José Chacha Jiménez garnered 39% of the vote against the Democratic Machine's candidate, Chris Cohen, opening the door for later Latino candidates. In 1982 in Chicago, the Young Lords were the first Latino group to join with and to organize a major event for the successful campaign of the first African-American mayor, Harold Washington. Soon after Washington's victory, Chacha Jiménez introduced the new mayor to a crowd of 100,000 Puerto Ricans in Humboldt Park in June 1983. That day the Young Lords gave out 30,000 buttons with Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón inscribed on them. In the fall of 1995, Chicago Young Lords Tony Baez, Carlos Flores, Angel Del Rivero, Omar Lopez and Angie Linda Adorno were brought together again by Jose Cha-Cha Jimenez to form the Lincoln Park Project. They archived the history of the Young Lords and documented the displaced Latinos and the poor of the Lincoln Park neighborhood, to show support for the Puerto Rican VX campers and to continue the struggle for Puerto Rican independence as well as against the displacement of Puerto Ricans and other poor within the diaspora. The Young Lords organized Lincoln Park Camp on September 23, 2002, near Grand Rapids, Michigan. Over 120 people camped out together for the weekend. Many Young Lords showed support for the freed Puerto Rican nationalist leaders and urban guerrilla groups like the Macheteros. Others later joined more explicitly Maoist formations, like the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers' Party, and others went on to provide the leadership of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. Some worked within the media, such as Juan Gonzalez of the New York Daily News and Democracy Now!, Pablo Yoruba Guzman at WCBS-TV New York, Felipe Luciano and Miguel Mickey Melende of WBAI-FM New York. Legacy. The documentary Palante, Siempre Palante, The Young Lords, produced by Young Lord Iris Morales, aired on PBS in 1996. In 2015, a retrospective presente, The Young Lords in New York, was held in New York City. In 2001, Omar Lopez, Minister of Information of the Young Lords, donated a small amount of archival material that were materials collected for use in the Young Lords newspapers and were being stored by him to DePaul University's Special Collections and Archives Department, and a portion of the archival materials were digitized as part of DePaul's digital collection. In 2012, it was the 120 oral histories of Young Lords in Lincoln Park collection housed at Seidman College at Grand Valley State University. In 2010, New York University Press published The Young Lords, a reader which was edited by Darrell Enkwanza and included a foreword by former Young Lords Iris Morales and Denise Oliver v. Acute LEZ. The book offers a look into the Young Lords through primary documents such as speeches and articles from Parlante, the Young Lords newspaper, interviews, posters, and photographs.